The Eorlingas or Rohirrim were the greatest horse lords of Middle-earth's Third Age, a proud and noble people renowned for their unmatched horsemanship and fierce loyalty. Dwelling in Rohan's seas of grass, their society was built around a deep bond with their steeds, and their culture reflected themes of honor, courage, and kinship. Brought into existence by a passionate student of the real-life past, their culture, language, and history were inspired by the Anglo-Saxons, Goths, and Scandinavians of our world. The Rohirrim play a pivotal role in the War of the Ring, standing as a beacon of hope in the fight against overwhelming darkness, symbolizing the enduring spirit of those who defend their land and freedom. This episode is about the history of the Rohirrim. After waking up in Hildorian, the three houses of men migrated west for Beleriand, but there were those of House Beor and Hador who stayed behind, occupying Eriador and Rhovanion. These men, who had not heeded the summons of the Valar, nor fallen under the influence of Morgoth, became known as Northmen. They were skilled riders, living in scattered homesteads fortified with wooden fences and dikes. The Northmen remained separated from the Eldar and Edain for centuries, falling back into a primitive state. After Morgoth's defeat, the Orcs became leaderless and reckless, with many raiding the Northmen who were defenseless against them. In exchange for foodstuffs, the Longbeards began trading tools, weapons, and services, allying with the Northmen. Better armed, the men of the north were thus able to defend their homesteads and could act as scouts, keeping watch over the movement of orcs and beasts. During the Second Age, the Númenóreans returned to the coasts of Middle-earth. There they discovered the Northmen, whose language was related to Andunaic, and realized they were the forefathers of the Edain. They proclaimed the friendly Northmen of Rhovanion to be middlemen, as they had neither heeded the call of the Valar nor fell to the influence of Morgoth. The majority of middlemen descended from Beorians and Hadorians, with a small minority of Halethians found in Eriador. During the Dark Years, Sauron invaded Eriador and Rhovanion in SA 1695. Hordes of orcs and Easterlings overwhelmed the Dwarves and Northmen, breaking their alliance. The Northmen were scattered and diminished in number, becoming impoverished and forced to live in caves or along the borders of Greenwood. Eriador and Rhovanion came under the dominion of Sauron until its liberation by the Númenóreans and Gil-galad. However, Númenor soon fell under the shadow, and their colonists began oppressing the men of Middle-earth, demanding tribute, enslaving them, and using them for human sacrifice. During the early part of the Third Age, the Northmen flourished, spreading southwards and consolidating into a formidable group residing along the eastern fringes of Mirkwood and the lands eastward to the River Running. They became famed breeders and riders of horses. Meanwhile, east of them, wild men with minds full of hatred sought slaughter and plunder in the west. In TA 490, Easterlings suddenly invaded Gondor, advancing over the plain between the inland sea and the Ash Mountains. They plundered and killed many in Gondor's northeast, particularly northern Ithilien. King Osterher was quite old and infirm, thus charging his son Turastar to drive out the invaders. Gondor endured 10 years of their attacks until TA 500, when Turastar defeated them. 41 years later, the Easterlings renewed their attacks on Gondor. Turastar led a host against them, but was slain in battle. His son, Turambar, avenged his father's death, decisively defeating the Easterlings in Gondor's northeast in TA 541. Unlike his father, he did not let up and led a campaign deep into Rhûn. By TA 550, Gondor conquered east of Dagorland, south of Rhovanion, north of the Ash Mountains, and west of the Sea of Rhûn. These lands became the Eastern Territories, and Northmen likely helped Gondor settle the new Eastern Territories. From Faramir's conversation with Frodo and Sam in the Two Towers, we learn that many Northmen were recruited during the war against the Easterlings. However, some Northmen also assailed Gondor and even joined the Easterlings. It was during this time that the kings of Gondor recognized common ancestry with the Northmen of Rhovanion and made them subjects. In TA 1000, Gondor granted the Northmen the land south of Mirkwood to serve as a buffer state against the Easterlings. The Northmen flourished there and soon formed the Kingdom of Rhovanion. During the days of Etanatar II, the Northmen south of Mirkwood and in the Upper Anduin had greatly increased in number and power. During the rule of Narmestil I, the Easterlings resumed their raids, and it was discovered some Northmen joined with them for plunder. In TA 1248, Regent Minilcar raised a great force and recruited Northmen led by Prince Vidugavia. Together they defeated a large Easterling army between Rhovanion and the Sea of Rhûn, destroying their encampments there. Minalcar then fortified the western shore of the Anduin up to the river Limelight. Minalcar recruited many Northmen into his service as Videgavia became a king amongst them. In TA 1250, Minalcar sent his son, Prince Valakar, to the court of Videgavia as an ambassador to learn their language, culture and politics. Valakar quickly fell in love with their country and their people, and even married Videgavia's daughter, Vidumavi. In TA 1255, they had a son named Vinatharia. 5 years later, King Romendasil II recalled Valakar for duties, and he brought his family to Gondor. There were those in Gondor who disapproved of the heir to the crown marrying a foreigner, whose life expectancy was less than half that of a Dunedain. Many feared that intermarrying with such peoples would shorten the life and fall of majesty for the kings of Gondor. Thus, many did not accept Valakar as their lord. Regardless, Vidumavi lived a long life and took the name Gladwyn for public use in Gondor, learning the language and manners of Gondor well. She was fair, noble, and high of courage, and passed these traits on to her children. She died in TA 1332 before her husband took the throne. Her son Vinatharia was given the name Eldacar for public use in Gondor. Valakar was vigorous during his reign, but as he grew old, disaffection grew, and an open rebellion broke out in the southern provinces. In TA 1432, Eldacar took the throne, throwing Gondor into a civil war known as the Kinstrife. Eldacar's enemies were led by his second son Castamir, who was the captain of ships and had the support of Umbar, Pelagia and other coastal regions. Castamir captured Osgiliath, destroying much of the city and racking up a body count that included Eldacar's son, Onendil, before seizing the throne. As a usurper king, Castamir was cruel and tried to move the throne from Osgiliath to Pelagia, losing the support of the people of Gondor. Meanwhile, Eldacar feigned going into exile and sought refuge amongst his kinfolk in Rhovanion. There he rallied a great army of Northmen and Gondorians from the northern provinces. After 10 years, Eldacar came out of the north with his great army, as folk flocked to him from Calenarthon, Anorion and Ithilien. In TA 1447, Eldacar and Castamir's forces met at the crossing of Erui, where Eldacar was victorious and slew Castamir personally. However, many of Castamir's followers managed to flee to Pelagia. In TA 1448, Eldacar besieged Pelagia, but had no navy to thwart the rebels from escaping to Umbar, where they allied themselves to Black Númenóreans and the Haradrim. The sons of Castamir established the Corsairs of Umbar as a refuge for all enemies of Gondor. Gondor had lost much blood to the Kinstrife, but large numbers of Northmen soon replenished her population. Thereafter, the blood of House Anarion and other noble families of the Dunedain became mingled with the Northmen. During the very cold winter of TA 1635, a great plague hit Rhovanion at a time when the Northmen dwelled in wooden houses and thronged stables, and were not as skilled as Gondor in the arts of healing and medicine. As a result, half of them died alongside their horses. In TA 1851, an Easterling confederacy known as the Wainriders suddenly invaded west, first engaging the Kingdom of Rhovanion. The Wainriders were stronger and better armed than any Easterlings that had attacked before, and presented an existential threat to the Northmen. At this time, the Kingdom of Rhovanion was led by Mahari, a descendant of Videgavia. The Wainriders, with their wagons and chariots, quickly killed, enslaved and scattered the Northmen. Their scattered remnants were recruited by King Narmasil II, who took a great army north and into the plains south of Mirkwood. In TA 1856, the Wainriders descended upon their army from the north and northeast, slaying Narmasil II. The survivors retreated over the Daggerland and into Ithilien, who would have been annihilated had it not been for Mahari, who died fighting in the rearguard. Thus, the frontiers of Gondor withdrew to the Anduin and Emyn Muil, and most of the Northmen were reduced into servitude, their former lands occupied. Those Northmen who managed to escape and merge with the folk of Dale, Gondor and others were gathered by Mawini, the son of Mahari. Mawini took these refugees north to settle in the Vales of Anduin, where they were joined by many fugitives who came through the forest. These people all shared a common love of horses and thus donned the name Éothéod, meaning people of the horses. Many of the names and customs of the Éothéod bear a Gothic hue, and their tongue, Rohanese, finds its echoes in the Mercian dialect of Old English. Gondor knew nothing of all this migration, and would only find out about the existence of the Éothéod in TA 1899. That year, Mawini sent messengers to King Kalametar, warning him that the Wainriders planned to raid Calenarthon and that his enslaved kinfolk amongst them were planning a revolt. With this knowledge, Kalametar led an army out of Ithilien. The Wainriders descended upon him with all the strength they could spare, drawing away from their homes. Meanwhile, Mawini aided the revolt, resulting in desperate outlaws storming out of Mirkwood and rousing the enslaved Northmen. Together they burned much of the Wainriders' camps, storehouses and wagons. However, the Wainriders did not leave their homes completely defenseless, for their women, children and elderly remained and gave a fierce fight. Most of the Northmen perished in the attempt, as they were ill-armed. After this, they returned to Éothéod, never to regain their lost homes. A battle broke out upon the Daggerland, and at its height, horsemen, led by Mawini, launched a surprise assault on the Wainriders' flank and rear. The enemy was broken, but Kalametar did not pursue them. Mawini harried them in their long route over the plains, until they were within far sight of Mirkwood, taunting them all the while. "Fly east, not north, folk of Sauron! See, the homes you stole are in flames!" During the reign of Fourth Wini, the Éothéod became troubled again by raids south of their land, both up the river and through Mirkwood. Fourth Wini received reports from his spies that the Wainriders had recovered their strength and were passing south of Mordor, fighting with the men of Khand and Near Harad. However, the conflict soon ended as they allied together, hatching a plan to assail Gondor from the north and south. Fourth Wini warned King Onderher of the new threat. However, Gondor was weakened at this time and could do no more than gather and train as great an army as they could. Onderher formed a northern and southern army. The southern army was led by Eonil, based out of Pelegir, while King Onderher himself led the northern army alongside his son Artemir. Onderher led his host north through Ithilien and deployed them upon the Daggerland, expecting to do battle there. However, the Wainriders had gathered a great host south of the Sea of Rhun, bolstered by their kinfolk in Rhovanion and their new allies from Khand. They advanced along the line of Ered Lithui. Onderher was nearing Morannon when the enemy's vanguard showed up. Not only war chariots of the Wainriders, but also enormous cavalry from Khand. Onderher frantically called for his captain of the right wing, Minotaur, to cover his left flank, but the chariots and cavalry crashed into his disordered line. Onderher hastily took his guard and banner to a low knoll to evade the enemy's charge, but it was to no avail. His banner was captured, his guard nearly annihilated, and he and his son Artemir were slain. The enemy drove deep, scattering and pursuing them westwards into the dead marshes. After this, Minotaur took command and ordered the army to take up a defensive position between Caer Andros and the mountains of Ephel-Duath, leading a rearguard to cover the movement. The enemy, greatly emboldened, made their way into the narrow land of Ithilien, a terrain ill-suited for them. As they turned south into the narrow land of trees under the shadow of Ephel-Duath, they ran through a deep cutting. Although Faramir had been ordered by his father to remain in Minas Tirith, acting as regent, he took on a disguise and sortied. Faramir joined a battalion of Éothéod and together ambushed the Wainriders at Ephel-Duath. This clash came at a high cost. Faramir died in the arms of Fourth Wini as the Wainriders halted their advance and held a feast celebrating their great victory. Thereafter, Northwind sent the body of Faramir to Minotaur, who was soon also slain by arrows as the enemy poured into northern Ithilien. As the Wainriders celebrated, Eonil returned after crushing the Haradrim and raced north to aid the northern army. He attacked the Wainriders during their feasting, descending upon their camps, burning their wains, and driving many into the swamplands of the dead marshes. While wicked men persistently attacked from the east and south, another threat emerged in the north. In TA 1973, Gondor, the Éothéod, and other Northmen joined the host of the west to defeat Angmar. Their vast army got aboard a massive fleet set for harbours in the north. However, they came too late, for in TA 1974, the Witch King came down upon Arthedain, capturing and occupying Fornost while driving most of the Dunedain over the Lune. For a while, Avidui hid in Old Dwarf mines, but he was driven out by hunger and sought the help of the Lossoth, the snowmen of Forochel. He stayed with them a while, but upon trying to sail out for safety, he would drown at sea. Meanwhile, the fleet arrived in TA 1975, and the people were in awe at the sight of the proud princes of the Éothéod, who were tall, fair, and mounted atop beautiful horses from the Vales of Anduin. Círdan and Glorfindel summoned all who would come from Lindon, Arnor, and Rivendell, and when all were ready, the great host crossed the Lune, marching north to challenge the Witch King of Angmar. It is said that even some hobbit archers came to aid the king. The Witch King, in his pride, met them on the plains of Nenúil instead of waiting within Fornost. Angmar's army was routed, retreating to Fornost, whence out of the north came the main body of cavalry passing around hills and scattering them into a rout. With the army in disarray, the Witch King turned north, but before he escaped, his old fortress of Khan Dum was overtaken by cavalry led by Prince Eorlingas. Glorfindel's army then arrived, and together they utterly crushed Angmar's host as the Witch King fled for Mordor. Because of the fall of Angmar, the shadow of Dol Guldur spreading, and the constant ravages of Easterlings, in TA 1977, the Éothéod went north in search of more habitable lands. To that end, Lord Frumagar led the Éothéod to a new land north of Mirkwood, between the Misty Mountains and the Forest River, driving away the remnants of the people of Angmar. Éothéod still dwelt in their former homes and were in contact with Gondor, but the majority of them took residence in the new northern lands, some 800 miles from Minas Tirith. It was also here in TA 1977 that Fram, son of Frumgar, slew the dragon Scatha and seized his treasure. Scatha had stolen his treasure from the dwarves, who now demanded it back from Fram, but he rebuked their claim and instead sent them a necklace made of dragon teeth, with the message, "Jewels such as these you will not match in your treasuries, for they are hard to come by." It is rumoured that the dwarves killed him for this insult. The new capital of Éothéod was named after him, Framsburg, lying between the rivers Greylin and Langwell, where many strong horses were found. For the next 500 years, the Éothéod slipped into the background of Middle-earth's history. During these centuries, the enemy captured Minas Ithil, the dwarves lost Moria, the line of kings in Gondor was broken, Gollum found the One Ring, and the Watchful Peace began. One story we hear is about Leod, lord of the Éothéod, who managed to capture a white foal. In TA 2501, Leod tried to ride the horse, but he was kicked off to his death. His son Yol hunted down the horse, and upon finding him, named him Felaroth, or Mansbane. Yol then demanded the horse give up its freedom in payment for his father's death. The horse agreed and took the name given to it. Felaroth was the first of the legendary Miras to be ridden by men. During the Watchful Peace, Sauron was not idle, breeding a new race of orcs in Mordor called the Uruk-hai. The Dark Lord also forged a strong alliance between various tribes of Easterlings, known as the Balchoth. They were a fierce people living under the shadow of Dol Guldur, having migrated from east of the Sea of Rhun to the wide lands between the Forest of Mirkwood and the River Running. They were descendants of the Wain Riders, though they were crude in weapons and mostly used horses to draw their large wagons. During this time, Gondor kept a watchful eye on the east and was often assailed in the south by the Corsairs of Umbar. The Gondorian forts along the Anduin, especially on the west shores of the Undeeps, went unmanned and neglected. The people of Kalinathon dwindled, mixing blood more and more with Easterlings, as Dunlendings drifted steadily and unchecked over the Isen. In TA 2509, the steward Cirion became aware that the Balchoth were preparing to attack Gondor, assembling a great host along the southern eaves of Mirkwood. Within this peril, Cirion sent 6 messengers to the Éothéod, calling for their aid. It was an incredible 900-mile journey through lands patrolled by the enemy. One messenger, Borendir, got through after 15 days of riding. King Yol sat a while in silence after hearing his message, and said, "I will come. If the Mundburg falls, whither shall we flee from the darkness?" Yol rallied 7,000 fully armed riders and some hundreds of horse archers, and led atop Felaroth, riding down the Vales of Anduin. In TA 1510, Sauron unleashed orcs down the Misty Mountains, Uruk-hai from Mordor against Ithilien and Osgiliath, and a great host of Balchoth advanced through the Brown Lands, crossed the Anduin on rafts, and overran Kalinathon. Cirion led an army north into Kalinathon, leaving his son Halas to command at Minas Tirith. His army was defeated in the Wold and cut off from the south. They were driven across the Limelight, where they were assailed by the orc host of the Misty Mountains and pressed towards the Anduin. When all hope seemed lost, horns of the Éothéod rang out from the north as they charged into the rear of the enemy. The battle reversed, as the enemy was slaughtered over the Limelight. Yol hunted the enemy down over the plains of Kalinathon, saving Gondor. Cirion gifted Yol and his people the land of Kalinathon from Anduin to Isen, and they took an oath of perpetual friendship that their two realms would come to each other's aid. Yol named their new land the Mark of the Riders, while those in Gondor called it Rohan. Their people took the name Eorlingas, or Rohirrim, meaning horse lords. Yol became the first king of Rohan, ruling over a kingdom whose borders extended west to the junction of the rivers Isen and Adorn, south to the White Mountains, east to the mouths of Entwash, and north to the tributary Limelight. Rohan was primarily divided into two regions, the Eastmark and Westmark. Other province-like regions included the Eastfold, Westfold, Westmarch, Wold, East Emnet, and West Emnet. Jarl established his natal kingdom's new capital, Aldburg, in the Fold. Throughout the ages, Rohan would inherit several old Gondorian fortresses, such as the fabled Dun Harrow and the mighty Hornburg, standing as sentinels over her realm. Over time, the Rohirrim began speaking Rohanese, a language which evolved from the ancient speech of the Éothéod, kin to the tongues of Northmen. The land of Rohan was a realm of vast pasturelands, perfect for the breeding and riding of horses, which the Rohirrim held dear above all things. The lives and culture of the Rohirrim were entwined with the fate of those noble beasts. The most renowned were the Miras, whose forebears the Rohirrim believed were brought over by Bema from Aman. It is said that the Miras could understand the speech of men, and were unmatched in strength, wisdom and speed. None but the kings and princes of the Rohirrim and Gandalf the White could ride them. The most famous Miras were the White Felaroth, Snowmane, and the Swift Shadowfax, whose coat was grey. Tolkien scholar Tom Shippey surmised that the Rohirrim were Tolkien's version of what the real-world Anglo-Saxons might have become had they remained a horse-riding folk and withstood the Norman invasion. Indeed, the emblem of the House of Jarl, a white horse upon a field of green, bears a likeness to the ancient Uffington horse, carved upon the chalk hills of England. Moreover, the Rohirrim have been likened to the Ostrogoths, for both peoples lived alongside greater civilizations, the Rohirrim with Gondor and the Ostrogoths with the Byzantine or Eastern Roman Empire. Incidentally, many believe Tolkien based Gondor upon the grandeur of the Byzantine Empire. The warriors of Rohan were almost all mounted, known far and wide as the Riders of the Mark. Their primary military unit was an Ered, a unit of roughly 120 riders, 1/100th of the full muster known as an Eorhiri. The Ered bore a likeness to the chosen bands of warriors who guarded the halls of the Anglo-Saxon lords, evolving later into the Huskarls of the Danish kings, warriors who dwelt in the Lord's Hall and were sworn to his defence. Alongside Rohan's professional riders, they also had a defensive conscripted infantry militia. This infantry bore a likeness to the Anglo-Saxon Fyrd, a militia that served in times of war, raised to bolster the numbers of the professional riders, but seldom called to fight far from home. In TA 2545, the Easterlings renewed their attacks, and Jarl fell in battle in the Wold. His son Brego defeated the Easterlings, driving them out of the Wold. Jarl was buried in the Royal Mound, alongside Felaroth, beginning the first line of kings. Jarl was succeeded by Brego, who became Rohan's second king. Brego moved the capital to Edoras, where he also built the Golden Hall of Meduseld in TA 2569. Edoras was built on a hill in Harrowdale, lying under the great mountain Starkhorn. The capital was encircled by a wall, with a dike dug around the hill. Outside of it was Barrowfield, where the tombs of the rulers of Rohan were placed. Brego explored Rohan with his son Baldur, coming to Harrowdale, where an old man surprised them with a riddle and told them the way was shut. In TA 2569, during the inauguration of Meduseld, Baldur vowed to pass the Dark Door, and did so the year after, never to be seen alive again. Brego died of grief in TA 2570, and his second son Aldor took the throne. Aldor reigned for 75 years, the longest of any ruler of Rohan. During his rule, the Dunlendings east of the Isen River were driven out, and Harrowdale and other valleys in the Eret Nimrais were settled. Aldor had 3 daughters and 1 son, Freya. Freya was already 75 years old when he took the throne, reigning for 14 years during a time of peace and prosperity. His son Freyrwine took the throne at more than 60 years of age. Little is said of his 20-year reign, though rumours state he mingled with the Dunlendings. His son Goldwine took the throne at the age of 26, ruling for 19 years. In TA 2699, Deor took the throne, and under his reign, the Peace of Rohan ended. The Gondorian chieftains of Isengard had mingled and allowed Dunlendings to settle around them. Eventually, they seized control of the fortress and killed its ancient guards. The Dunlendings began to migrate into the northern Westfold again, raiding herds and studs. Deor led an expedition, overcoming Dunlending attacks to find Isengard overrun. Deor sent word to Gondor, but no help came. Without the power to storm the Great Tower, he had riders constantly patrol its area. Deor's son Gram inherited a time of war with the Dunlendings, who continued to raid and harass the Rohirrim. He ruled for 23 years. Then in TA 2741, the throne passed to Helm. Helm was a grim man of great strength. One of his vassals was Freyke, a rich and powerful man controlling wide lands on both sides of the River Adorn. Freyke claimed he descended from King Freowain, but many said he had much Dunlendish blood and was very dark-haired. He made a stronghold and often ignored calls to counsel from Helm, who distrusted him. In TA 2754, Freyke came to a council where he requested Helm's daughter to marry his son, Wulf. Helm rebuffed him and called him fat. Freyke insulted Helm in anger, and after the council the two men went outside. There, Helm punched Freyke so hard it killed him, henceforth known as Hammerhand. Afterwards, Helm proclaimed Freyke's son and kin to be the king's enemies. Wulf fled to Dunland, where he was warmly received. There, for 4 years, he built up a Dunlendish army and allied with the Corsairs of Umbar. During the so-called Long Winter of 2758, Corsairs and Haredrim attacked Gondor, preventing it from coming to Rohan's aid, while Wulf and his allies attacked the Horse Lords. Unable to defend against the overwhelming numbers, Helm was defeated at the crossings of Isen. The majority of the Rohirrim fled to the fortress Suthburg, which would be known as Hornburg or Helm's Deep afterwards, while Edoras was defended by the king's son, Haleth. Wulf soon killed Haleth and took the capital, declaring himself the king. His armies besieged Suthburg, leading to a long and costly winter investment. It is said that Helm fought ferociously, leading countless sallies against the enemy, but hunger and dwindling numbers were too much, and sometime in early 2759 the king died, along with many of his people. The details are lost, but the siege was lifted either by the Rohirrim or because the Dunlendings got tired of maintaining it. Regardless, the long winter was finally over in March of 2759, and Helm's nephew, Freolaf Hildason, used the spring floods and led a contingent of Rohirrim down from Dunharrow, where a group of his people had survived, towards Edoras. Taking the Dunlendings entirely by surprise, they routed the defending force, killing Wulf and successfully reclaiming their capital. It is at this point a force of Gondorians joined with Freolaf's troops, and their combined might prevailed over the invaders, sending them back to the western wastes. Helm Hammerhand died alongside his sons Hammer and Haleth, leaving Helm's nephew Freolaf to become king. In so doing, the second line of kings was formed. Beneath the hall at Edoras, the kings of old were laid to rest in great burial mounds in 2 long lines, one for each royal house. Recalling the ancient barrows at Sutton Hoo in England and Gamla Uppsala in the lands of Sweden. At his inauguration, the wizard Saruman came, offering his support and friendship, which Freolaf accepted. After suffering from the long winter of TA 2759, the Dunlendings were starved out of Isengard and forced to capitulate to Freolaf. After this, the king recommended to his steward Beren that Saruman should take up residence in Isengard, on the condition he protected it from the Dunlendings. Freolaf reigned for 39 years and was succeeded by his son Britta Leoffa in TA 2798. Britta inherited a battered Rohan in which many men, cattle and horses had died from the long winter and war with the Dunlendings. Britta was a generous king who helped all of those in need, earning the name Leoffa because he was loved by all. Britta would be the longest-lived king of the second line, ruling for 44 years. During his reign, the orcs of the Misty Mountains, fleeing from Nandihirion, attempted to cross Rohan to establish themselves in the White Mountains. This resulted in many clashes in the Dales, but by the time of Britta's death, it was believed that the orcs had been hunted out. In TA 2842, his son Walder took the throne. However, only 9 years into his rule, he was ambushed and killed by orcs, while riding with his companions by the mountain paths from Dunharrow. His son, the great hunter Folka, took the throne in TA 2851, vowing to hunt any wild beast until there was no orc left in Rohan. Holka led his people to destroy every orc holdout, and when they were eradicated, he went to the Firion Wood to hunt. Within Everhold, Folka came across a great boar, whom he slayed, but died from tusk wounds in TA 2864. Folka was succeeded by his son Folkwein in TA 2864. It was under the reign of Folka's son, Folkwein, that Rohan finally returned to its earlier stability and strength. Fortunately, this was just in time for the Rohirrim to aid Gondor when the Haradrim invaded yet again in 2885. Fulkwyn sent his sons, Fulkred and Fastred, to lead the forces of Rohan against an immense army of the Haradrim. Although the combined forces of Gondor and Rohan ultimately prevailed at the Battle of the Crossing of Poros, the allies' losses were immense, and both Fulkred and Fastred were slain. So it was Fulkwyn's youngest son, Fengel, who took up the crown of Rohan. Fengel neglected his people, amassing riches only for himself, and proving a foolish and wasteful ruler. He often quarrelled with his advisors, family and marshals, becoming so troublesome that when his son Thengel reached manhood, he left his court and served Steward Turgon until his father's death. In TA 2953, Thengel and his family reluctantly came back to Rohan to take the throne. Thengel abandoned Rohanese, speaking the tongue of Westron in his house and introducing Sindarin into his line, something many Rohirrim disapproved of. During the year of his inauguration, Saruman discovered servants of Dol Guldur were hunting for the One Ring in all the rivers of the Anduin. Fearing Sauron would find the ring before he did, Saruman began fortifying Isengard, seeking to rival Barad-dûr. He began drawing servants from those who hated Gondor and Rohan, whether they were men or creatures that were more evil. During Thengel's rule, Thorangil came to Rohan and served him for some time. Thengel married Morwen of Lossarnach in TA 2943. Morwen's father was a descendant of a former prince of Dol Amroth, and thus a kinsman of Prince Imrahil. She bore him Theoden, Theodwyn, and 3 unnamed daughters. Being of a high Dunedain lineage, Morwen's descendants were said to be considerably taller than the average Rohirrim, especially Éomer. Thengel died in TA 2980, leaving the throne to Theoden. Theoden was born in Gondor, where he spent the first 5 years of his life learning Westron, Rohanese, and Sindarin. He loved his sister Theodwyn dearly, who went on to marry Eormund, a descendant of Eofor, the 3rd son of Brego. Eormund dwelt in Aldburg and was the marshal in charge of the East Marches, defending the horse herds from Orc raids. In TA 3002, while pursuing an Orc raid, he was ambushed in the Emyn Muil and slain. Theodwyn grew ill and died shortly after. Heartbroken, Theoden adopted their 2 children as his own. Éomer grew to be much taller than most Rohirrim, becoming a valiant warrior and rider. He was appointed the 3rd Marshal of the Riddermark, taking residence in Aldburg and defending Rohan from many Orc raids. His sword was called Guthwini, which is Old English for battle friend. His sister, Éowyn, meaning lover of horses in Old English, grew to be tall and slender, with a grace and pride that came from her mother. Theoden trusted her to take care of the Meduseld, and named her ruler of Rohan in his or Éomer's absence. Theoden married Elfhild, who died during childbirth in TA 2978, giving birth to Theodred. Theodred was the only son and thus heir to Theoden, and would hold the title of 2nd Marshal of the Riddermark. Theoden would inherit one of the most troublesome times in the history of Middle-earth, the time of the War of the Ring. At this time, Saruman's use of the Palantir led to his corruption by Sauron. He began to make trouble for the Rohirrim, and openly declared himself to be the Lord of Isengard. Saruman had finally forged an army in order to set himself up as an equal to Sauron. In doing so, he had torn down the trees within Isengard and the surrounding area in order to fuel his forges of industry. He ordered Orcish and Dunlending raids upon the ailing kingdom of Rohan, whose king he had begun to corrupt and sway towards inaction and frailty. The culmination of his experiments on the Orcs was the fighting Uruk-hai, a breed of half-orc, half-humans, who were many times stronger than their Orcish brethren. Yet the true core of their strength lay in the fact that, unlike the Orcs, they were totally unaffected by sunlight. Making use of this vital characteristic, he dispatched the strongest of his experiments to hunt down the Fellowship. As Saruman unleashed his new army, he also made sure to employ evil means of neutralizing Rohan by going after its leadership. King Theoden, who had shown such promise at a young age, had grown old and weary, as by the time of the War of the Ring he had reigned for 40 years. Unbeknownst to the noble king, his chief counselor, a native of Rohan, Grima, who soon was to be nicknamed Wormtongue, was in the employ of Saruman, and was slowly poisoning Theoden's food, slowly corrupting his mind and weakening both the king and the kingdom. His strategic advice of constant retreat left the countryside defenseless. The king himself was kept in the palace, leaving the protection of the realm in the hands of Theoden's son Theodred and his nephew Éomer. Saruman recognized the need to remove this last bastion of heroism and valor in Rohan, and soon set in motion his plan to destroy the Rohirrim. The defenders of the realm knew that they had to keep the crossings over the River Isen in order to prevent the unification of the enemy forces. The crossing point on the River Isen was crucial, as it was the only such point at which a large army could cross, and Saruman had already managed to sneak a small force across to gain a foothold. Theodred learned of this and secretly moved the troops directly under his command to get rid of that threat. On February 23, 3019 of the Third Age, the Riders of Rohan scored an easy victory here, destroying the enemy unit. In the aftermath, Theodred initially displayed the tactical acumen of his ancestor Eorl, and decided to defend the crossings against any future incursions. However, soon the young prince heard of a great force gathering in Isengard. On the 24th of February, attempting to preempt this massive force assaulting Rohan, Theodred left 3 companies of cavalry to guard the ford, taking with him 8 companies of cavalry and a company of bowmen to meet the forces of the wizard. Unfortunately for him, Saruman had already amassed his forces and was able to send a detachment to the west to lie in wait for the force of Rohan. Theodred unwittingly walked into the trap laid for him. Initially, his horsemen crushed a force of orcs 20 miles north of the fords, but with that, the prince dashed headlong into the main Isengard host. The Riders of Rohan still had a chance to win this engagement, but soon they were attacked by the ambushing force. Their flank lost cohesion and they suffered many casualties. Seeing his position was untenable, Theodred ordered a retreat to the fords, with the orcs and Uruk-hai in fierce pursuit. Here, Grimbold was given command of the troops on the western side of the river, with Theodred forming up on a small hilly islet in the centre of the fords in order to cover Grimbold should he be forced to retreat. But Isengard had another army on the eastern side of the Isen, and a flanking force of wargs and 2 battalions of orcs attacked the Rohirrim here, forcing the riders to flee south along the river, being chased by the orcs the entire time. The remainder of the orcs on the eastern bank, alongside a large number of Dunlending raiders, then crashed into Theodred's rear, while Grimbold's forces were simultaneously attacked on the western bank. Surrounded and outnumbered, Theodred cried for help, exclaiming, "To me, Eorlingas!" His call was answered by Grimbold, who led a small contingent towards the hill to save his liege. Grimbold, however, would arrive too late, only to see Theodred mortally wounded by an orc, who Grimbold in his fury struck down. The de facto leader of the Rohirrim now found himself in the same position as the son of the king, surrounded and likely to be slaughtered at any given moment. That is, until a horn was sounded on the eastern bank with the rising of the sun. Another distinguished captain of Rohan, Elfhelm, led 4 companies of cavalry from Edoras and surprised Saruman's forces, who were blinded by the burning light of the sun, always dangerous for the orcs. Isengard soldiers believed they had been attacked by a far greater host, with many fleeing. 2 companies were sent to slaughter the fleeing orcs, while Elfhelm led the remainder of his forces to relieve Grimbold on the hill, thundering into the Dunlendings, who threatened to overwhelm the beleaguered defenders. The Dunlendings were slaughtered to a man, and Elfhelm arrived just in time to prevent Grimbold's death at the hands of a Dunlending pike. Unfortunately, Theodred lay dying, and the 2 captains of Rohan knelt beside him as he gave his final words before dying moments later. "Let me lie here to protect the fords until Éomer arrives." Theodred's body was buried where he fell so he could guard the fords in perpetuity, while his death made Éomer the heir to the throne of Rohan. Still, Isengard had more than enough forces to threaten Rohan. After the first Battle of Isen, the command of the forces garrisoned there was given to Erkenbrand of the Westfold. However, until such time as he would arrive from Helm's Deep, command was shared between Elfhelm and Grimbold. Erkenbrand, a warrior of high esteem, who had previously retired from service but returned to his post seeing the threat posed to Rohan, left a force of 1,000 warriors to guard Helm's Deep, and ordered a general retreat of the populace to the fortress before heading out to assume his command. While he was on his way, Grimbold was still leading the force at Isen. He stationed his foot soldiers at the ford, and the remainder of his men with Elfhelm on the eastern bank, where he assumed the attack would come. The force sent by Saruman was comparatively small, but still far outnumbered the Rohirrim garrisoned there. In early March, the wizard soldiers attacked, forcing Grimbold to retreat across the ford with heavy casualties. Rohan's infantry, helmed by its leader, made their last stand here, assuming aid would come from Elfhelm. However, Warg Riders had made their way through the gap in the two flanks and threatened to surround Elfhelm's force. Elfhelm, aware of the danger posed to Grimbold, still sounded the retreat in the face of inevitable encirclement. Seeing the torches on the other bank, Grimbold now knew the full might of Isengard was set to bear down upon his position. He also retreated back to his camp, where a shield wall was formed. The forces of Isengard broke upon this redoubt time and again, yet the captain of Rohan knew he could not maintain this line indefinitely. Forming two groups of riders, he sent them to simultaneously attack both the north and south enemy flanks, and in the ensuing confusion, his troops were able to flee the battlefield and join up with the remnants of the army now commanded by Erkenbrand. While the army was preserved by the brave conduct of Grimbold, Rohan now lay open for invasion. Still, Saruman's plan had been delayed, which probably saved the Rohirrim. The army of Erkenbrand was still in the field, but it wasn't capable of stopping Isengard's advance, and Rohirrim slowly dispersed around the countryside. While these battles were raging, Éomer and his Eored, which was a company of 120 riders of Rohan, had been tracking down a company of Uruk-hai and Orcs who had been carrying Merry and Pippin to Isengard. The mounted Rohirrim were fast, and the fact that there was no unity among the enemy forces helped them gain ground. Indeed, the group about to be attacked by Éomer consisted of Saruman's Uruk-hai and a mixed group of Orcs from Moria and Mordor, led by Grishnak. These factions had their own disagreements, as Morian Orcs wanted to kill the hobbits to avenge their brethren killed by the Fellowship, while the leader of the Uruk-hai, Ugluk, had orders to bring them to Saruman. At the same time, Grishnak suspected that Ugluk's prisoners were connected to the ring, and was eager to bring them to his master in Mordor. At this point, the Orcs stopped and started arguing on their course of action, allowing Éomer's scout to notice them and gallop to his commander to bring the news. The argument the enemy was having ended in the only way it could have, and Ugluk killed some of the Orcs to show how serious he was about fulfilling his master's orders. The Orcs and Uruk-hai would have probably continued fighting amongst themselves, but they noticed the approaching Rohan horsemen and decided that it was time to flee. Their best hope was to enter the nearby forest, which they hoped would negate the speed of the Rohirrim. Éomer was outnumbered 2-1, but his troops were clearly superior. To not allow the Orcs to escape, the horsemen hemmed the enemy in along the river Entwash and started pushing them northwest. The Orcs, already tired from their long trek, started to slow down as the pursuit continued. The stragglers were shot by the Rohirrim arrows as the horsemen moved in to kill and then retreated to avoid the Orcish bows. Finally, Ugluk's creatures reached a small hill outside the forest of Fangorn, which they encamped on. Éomer didn't attack immediately, probably not wanting to lose any of his men, but still surrounded the Orcs on three sides. Not really fond of the forests, the Orcs were not eager to enter Fangorn, but Ugluk still sent a few to scout ahead. None of them returned, and Ugluk decided to abandon his initial idea. Hoping that the hobbits could be used as hostages, he loudly ordered his Orcs to kill them if the Rohirrim attempted to attack. Éomer sent in a few of his scouts, who crawled into the Orcish camp, killing a few and then disappearing. This distracted Ugluk, and his rival Grishnak used that to try and escape with the hobbits. However, he was discovered by a rider of Rohan and killed. The whole commotion in the Orcish camp made the Rohirrim close in a little bit, and it was then that a new unit of Uruk-hai entered the fray. Mauhur was leading one of the scouting parties sent by Saruman to find Ugluk and assist him, but he would ultimately fail as Éomer sent in his reserve, whose charge easily scattered the Uruk-hai. At dawn, the Rohirrim finally attacked the enemies on the hill, and Ugluk's soldiers shot the last of their arrows, killing a few. Ugluk amassed his best warriors and attempted to break out of the encirclement. Initially, his counterattack worked, and more riders were killed. But soon Éomer approached the leader of the Uruk-hai, dismounted and started dueling him, soon slaying the killer of Boromir. The last few orcs who attempted to flee were slaughtered. As these events unfolded, on March 2nd of TA 3019, King Theoden received guests at Edoras, including Gimli, Legolas, Aragorn and Gandalf the White. Arriving at the Great Hall and seeing a defeated people, Gandalf realized that Theoden was being corrupted. He deposed the king's advisor Grima, casting him out of the city, freeing Éomer and healing the effects of the poison on Theoden. Gandalf told Theoden all that Wormtongue had done to prevent his people from gathering their full strength, and how he had tried to prevent Éomer from pursuing the raiding orcs. Moreover, Theoden was told of how his son was slain. Needing Éomer for the battles ahead, Theoden entrusted the lordship of the Eorlingas to Éowyn. With the king healed and now clear of mind, they had to decide what to do next to save Rohan. Gandalf knew that Theoden didn't have enough forces to fight an open battle, and advised him to move to the impregnable Helm's Deep, while he himself rode to find Erkenbrand. Initially, the king wanted to ignore the Wizards' Council, so he left 1,000 soldiers to defend Edoras, while the civilian population was ordered to move to Dun Harrow under the command of his niece Éowyn. The king's host moved towards Isen to reinforce it, but met the survivors of the Battle of the Ford. It was clear that defending at Helm's Deep was the only choice the Rohirrim had left, so Theoden started moving there. Despite being advised by Grima that the walls of the fortress were impenetrable, Saruman had devised a solution with his sorcery, the fires of Orthanc, immensely destructive explosives. If placed in the weak spot of the deeping wall, a culvert that allowed water to pass from the glittering caves out of the fortress, the fires of Orthanc would destroy it. While the armies of Rohan and Isengard were on their way to fight a decisive battle at Helm's Deep, the ancient race of Ents was deliberating what actions they should take, and after 3 days, the Ent Moot decided that they would attack Isengard in what came to be known as the Last March of the Ents. Theoden arrived at Helm's Deep and met with the commander of the fortress in the absence of Erkenbrand, Gamling the Old, who had a force of 1,000 defenders of varying quality, as the majority of the finest fighters had followed Erkenbrand to the fords. With the forces of Theoden, the Rohirrim numbered just under 3,000 soldiers, allowing for the defences to be fully manned. Saruman's army consisted of Uruk-hai, the wild men of Dunland, orcs and half-orcs, and due to casualties suffered at the fords, was reinforced prior to arrival, meaning the 10,000 Uruk-hai and their auxiliary forces arrived on the 3rd of March. Despite the best preparations of those now standing atop the walls of the Hornburg, the situation remained a desperate one, causing Legolas to finally turn aside the lifelong enmity of the elves towards their Dwarven counterparts, and speak faithfully to his companion. "But you comfort me, Gimli. I'm glad to have you standing nigh with your stout legs and your hard axe. I wish there were more of your kin among us, but even more would I give for 100 good archers of Mirkwood." Newly made friends decided to test each other's mettle by counting the enemies they would kill in the upcoming battle. The battle began with the Uruks attacking the first line of defences of Hornburg, known as the Helm's Dyke. This was an ancient trench and rampart, about a quarter of a mile below the fortress, and stretched for a mile or more across the valley. It was immensely steep in some places, reaching 20 feet high at its peak, and the gap in the middle was also extremely wide, allowing for Theoden's rearguard to exact heavy casualties before abandoning the fortification. They were able to fill the trench with corpses of Uruks and men of Dunland before retreating back to the fortress proper. Passing the dike, the Uruks launched a massive hail of crossbow bolts and arrows at the fortress, but received no reply. Deceived by the eerie silence of the defenders, they approached the fortifications and were surprised by a hail of arrows and rocks, forcing them to lose cohesion and break ranks. Yet even in this disordered state, and despite heavy losses, the weight of their numbers allowed them to push forward and assault the main gate using tree trunks as battering rams. The gate barely held, creaking and buckling under the pressure. Requiring time to shore up their defences, Theoden sent an advance party of Aragorn, Gimli and Éomer through a small side gate and out onto the causeway in order to buy time. The ploy was successful, and the heroes managed to cause casualties, but then were counterattacked. As Aragorn and Éomer attempted to retreat through the side gate, the Horse Lord was set upon by several orcs, and if not for the intervention of Gimli, would have been slain. The dwarves' timely attack pushed the enemy back yet again, allowing the trio to retreat. Despite the best attempts of the Uruk-hai, the gate was still standing, so the attacking force hefted hundreds of ladders up against the deeping wall, and set about scaling the sprawling fortification. The defenders, who were already exhausted by the persistent fighting at this point, threw back assault after assault upon the battlements. Again, seeing the valour of men, a number of smaller orcs were sent by their Uruk commanders to crawl through the culvert and attack the defenders from behind. Gimli and Gamling led a company of men from the Westfold and slaughtered the orcs who had crawled through, bringing Gimli's tally to 21 kills, while Legolas now had 24. The company then set about blocking the culvert with stones and rocks to prevent such an attack. However, it is at this point that the sorcery of Saruman played its part. Placing the fires of Orthanc by the wall, a berserker was sent to set it ablaze. Although Legolas did the best he could with his bow, he wasn't able to bring down the torchbearer in time. The explosion brought down the culvert along with a large part of the deeping wall, leaving Gimli and his company isolated, while also bringing the fortress's defences to its knees. A massive host of Uruk-hai poured through the breach, and the defenders on the ground, led by Gimli, Éomer and Gamling, were pushed back into the glittering caves. Meanwhile, Aragorn and Legolas, who were atop the wall at the time of the explosion, engaged in a fighting retreat towards the keep, barely avoiding being overrun, with Legolas being forced to save Aragorn's life from an orc's blade. At this exact time, the Entish assault on Isengard began, with Treebeard leading from the front, accompanied by Merry and Pippin, who acted as rock throwers from on high. The rage of the Ents was incomparable, as they had first been created at the request of Yavanna, one of the Ainur and Valar, in order to protect her trees from the newly created race of the Dwarves, and had been taught the common tongue by the elves of old. Their strength was also unmatched, with Treebeard boasting that when roused to violence, they were stronger than any troll, with Morgoth having created the trolls in order to produce a force capable of matching them and failing in this regard. Following on from the Ent Moot within Fangorn Forest in Durdingle, the Ents decided to vent their fury at their failure to fulfill their duty in shepherding the trees, and with a common purpose of vengeance never before witnessed among the Ents, their fury drove them to enter the War of the Ring. With Isengard having been emptied due to the assault on the Hornburg, their defences were no match for the might of the Ents, accompanied by a sizable contingent of Huorns. Huorns were an ancient race of slow-moving trees who the Ents had cared for throughout the Second and Third Ages. Obeying their shepherds, they descended upon Isengard as a great dark forest, striking fear into the hearts of the token garrison left in Isengard, as the majority of the force had marched to join the Battle of the Hornburg. Treebeard and company tore down the walls of Isengard and created a dam over the Wizard's Vale, destroying the pits, mines and weapons of war which Saruman had accumulated, effectively cleansing the taint of darkness from the valley. Yet they were unable to break down the Tower of Orthanc, which had been forged by the Númenóreans, and as such, Saruman was effectively left as their prisoner. When news reached Sauron of this setback, he planned upon the reclamation of Isengard following on from his ultimate victory, to grant the Tower of Orthanc to his loyal Black Númenórean servant, the Mouth of Sauron. The situation in Helm's Deep was far grimmer. Gimli, Éomer and Gamling and their company barely kept the Uruk-hai at bay during the night within the glittering caves, while Theoden, Aragorn, Legolas and the surviving defenders were holed up in the keep, as the Uruk-hai prepared to make one final push through their defences the following day. Aragorn appeared just before dawn to offer parley, stating that if the Uruk-hai lay down their weapons, they would be spared. Laughing at this suggestion, they attempted to feather the last line of Isildur with arrows, almost killing him in the process. Theoden now began to despair, before being reminded by his comrades of the need to fight on in spite of the current desperate circumstances. The descendant of Yul pondered upon what had become of the Rohirrim. Where now are the horse and the rider? Where is the horn that was blowing? Where is the helm and the hauberk and the bright hair flowing? Where is the harp on the harp-string and the red fire glowing? Where is the spring and the harvest and the tall corn growing? They have passed like rain on the mountain, like a wind in the meadow. The days have gone down in the west, behind hills into shadow. Who shall gather the smoke of the dead wood burning, or behold the flowing years from the sea returning? Seeing that the defenders were desperate, the Uruk-hai broke down the gate of the keep, but were surprised to hear the horn of Helm Hammerhand sound in the deep. Their surprise did not last long, as Theoden, leading his riders alongside Aragorn and Legolas, burst forth and pushed the Uruk-hai back along the causeway. The men of Rohan were roused to particular fury by the words of their king, now restored to the full strength of his character and willing to lead them through whatever darkness lay ahead. Arise now, arise, riders of Theoden, dire deeds awake. Dark it is eastward, let horse be bridled, horn be sounded, forth Eorlingas. Simultaneously, upon hearing the horn of Helm Hammerhand, Gimli, Éomer and Gamling led their force out of the glittering caves, driving the Uruk-hai before them until they had retreated beyond the deeping wall. The Uruk-hai attempted to reform just beyond Helm's Dyke, as the two forces of Rohan converged to meet what was still a numerically superior foe in the field. The battle hung on a knife's edge, with the White Hand of Isengard still holding a significant advantage in terms of the force they could bring to bear. It is at this point that Gandalf appeared upon Shadowfax with the rising sun behind him. He had brought with him Erkenbrand and a force of 1,000 riders, battle-hardened survivors of the conflicts on the River Isen, led by their valiant captains Grimbold and Elfhelm. Likewise, an entirely newly arrived forest of strange trees blocked off the final avenue of escape. Following Gandalf's lead, the Eorlingas charged into the rear of the Uruk-hai, while Theoden and Éomer's forces supported the attack, crashing against the besiegers with all of the strength their exhausted soldiers could muster. The Sons of Yul would prove their valor once more, attacking the entrapped fighting Uruk-hai with a ferocity inspired by the men lost at the fords of Isen and in the previous raids on their country. The Uruks soon lost cohesion and broke ranks, ensuring their slaughter, with the survivors fleeing into the newly emerged forest to their detriment. Less than half of the 10,000 Uruks were able to flee into the forest, where they were all annihilated by the Ents and their younger saplings, the Horns, ending the Uruk threat for good and all in the Riddermark. The battle was a costly victory for the men of Rohan, yet the power of Isengard was utterly shattered in the process. The Dunlendings laid down their weapons and were granted amnesty by King Theoden, which came as a massive surprise to the wild men, who had been told by Saruman that any men who surrendered would be burned alive by the Rohirrim. Those who surrendered were put to work repairing the Hornburg by Erkenbrand, before being sent back to their homes in Dunland. Saruman's power was now broken, as he remained prisoner within Orthanc, unable to influence the events of the War of the Ring ever again. Following on from the Battle of the Hornburg, Gandalf, accompanied by Theoden, Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli, Treebeard, Merry and Pippin, approached the imposing might of Isengard, which the Ents could not breach due to its superior Númenórean design, and confronted Saruman, who, spiteful and proud even in defeat, refused the pleas of Gandalf to surrender, forcing the White Wizard to reluctantly expel his former friend from the Order, destroying his staff and leaving him powerless. Grima Wormtongue also refused the mercy of King Theoden, instead hurling Saruman's palantir at the king, narrowly missing him. Ever curious, Pippin dived into the watery depths now encompassing the fortress, recovering the palantir which had been corrupted by Sauron. the young hobbit came face to face with the Dark Lord himself, but paralysed by fear, said nothing. Still, his presence confirmed the defeat of Saruman, driving an icy shard of fear into Sauron. In the meantime, Saruman was left to his own devices, with the Ents to serve as his keepers. Upon returning to Helm's Deep, the group was met by the Grey Company, consisting of the remaining 31 members of the Dunedain, led by Aragorn's lieutenant Halbarad, and the twin sons of Elrond, Elladan and Elrohir. They brought with them advice from Galadriel and Elrond, as well as a standard made by Arwen, depicting the white tree upon a black background, with a crown placed above the tree, symbolizing what was to come. The decision was made that the heir of Isildur must make his presence known to his greatest adversary. Gazing deep within the Palantir, and holding the reforged blade, Anduril, Flame of the West, Aragorn confronted the Dark Lord, revealing that the heir of Isildur was soon to return as King of Gondor. Believing that Aragorn was now in possession of the One Ring, while also about to unite all of the free folk of Middle-earth behind his banner, the Dark Lord panicked. His well-laid plans were hastened, as he now saw the need for a preemptive strike on Gondor before Aragorn could assume the throne. Having been shown the sheer might of Sauron's forces through the Palantir, Aragorn was also forced to take desperate measures, in this instance departing the now rallying Rohirrim to walk the paths of the dead in order to save his people. Theoden took his company to the refuge of Dunharrow, and along the way offered Meriadoc Brandybuck a ride with his company, who in turn offered his sword in service to Rohan. On March 9th of TA 1319, an emissary of Gondor named Hirgon came to Theoden's tent. He presented the Red Arrow, invoking the Oath of Yall. Tolkien drew inspiration for this device from The House of the Wolfings by William Morris, who drew upon the old poem Aline and the History of the Danes, where Roman Emperor Constantine summoned the Visigoths to do battle against the Huns. To do this, Theoden proclaimed, "So we come to it in the end, the great battle of our time, in which many things shall pass away. But at least there is no longer need for hiding. We will ride the straight way and the open road, and with all our speed. The muster shall begin at once, and wait for none that tarry. Call the heralds, Eomer, let the riders be marshalled." Theoden could spare as little time as possible for the mustering of the riders, managing to rally 6,000 before departing for Minas Tirith on the dawnless day of March 10th. As the Rohirrim departed Harrowdale, a storm erupted from Mordor and veiled the sun. This was an attempt by Sauron to discourage his enemies from uniting against him. As the Rohirrim advanced, Theoden heard rumours that orcs had crossed the river and come down from the north, invading the wold of Rohan and Lothlorien. Yet there was nothing the Rohirrim could do, as Éomer cried, "Ride on! Ride on! Too late now to turn aside. The fens of Entwash must guard our flank. Haste now we need! Ride on!" On March 12th, the Ents defeated the orcs out on the wold, preventing an orc conquest of Rohan. On March 14th, Theoden was approached by Ganburi Gan, chieftain of the Druedain, whom the Rohirrim called the Woses. Ganburi Gan warned Theoden that a much larger force of evil men and orcs was waiting to ambush his forces. Ganburi Gan helped the Rohirrim evade the trap along the north-south road by taking them through the Stone Wain Valley in the Druedan forest. The Druedain scouted and hunted enemy spies, allowing the Rohirrim to reach Pelennor fields without molestation. For this great service, Theoden offered the Druedain the eternal friendship of Rohan. Henceforth the Rohirrim promised to never trouble them and would drive away the orcs that hunted them. Meanwhile, Minas Tirith was besieged. The forces of Mordor had brought forth a great battering ram, known as Grond, named in honour of the warhammer which the original Dark Lord Morgoth had wielded in battle in times long since past. This Hammer of the Underworld had been forged in the foundries of Barad-dûr specifically for the purpose of bringing down the Great Gate of Minas Tirith. The siege work itself was 60 feet in height and 150 long. Created of harsh metals, it maintained a permanent flame in its wolf-like maw, evidencing the vile sorcery used in its creation, and would require a great many trolls to even operate it. Despite its sturdiness, the Great Gate was no match for the greatest siege equipment of the Third Age, and was weakened by the Witch King's sorcery. According to our primary source on the battle, thrice the great ram boomed, and suddenly upon the last stroke, the gate of Gondor broke. As if stricken by some blasting spell, it burst asunder. There was a blast of searing lightning, and the doors tumbled in riven fragments to the ground. The gate had been destroyed utterly, and the forces of the Dark Lord seemed poised to storm the city by force. The Witch King, upon his fell beast, entered the city first, believing the battle to be all but won. Standing before him in the Courtyard of Kings was Gandalf the White, mounted upon Shadowfax, who confronted the greatest servant of the Dark Lord and his endless tides, which were ready to destroy the greatest city of man. The Witch King was at first uncertain, having seen firsthand the power the White Wizard could bring to bear, so the standoff continued for what seemed like an unceasing moment in time. Just as the two looked set to finally test the prophecy uttered so long ago in Arnor, a horn was heard far off in the fields of Pelennor, a horn both the Witch King and the White Wizard recognized. The sons of Eorl had come forth with the future of Middle-earth now resting upon their intervention. King Theoden of Rohan emerged upon a hillock on the edge of the Pelennor fields at the head of 6,000 riders of Rohan, where he looked down upon the doom of his age and did not falter, despite the immensity of the fight which now awaited the aged warrior king. The ranks of Orcs and Southrons now turned to face the new foe, which had emerged seemingly from nowhere. They had been caught unawares, and could not effectively reconfigure their formations to face what was to come. Theoden, turning to his men, organized his commanders, asking of them that they fear no darkness that day, before addressing the 6,000, now numbering as one of the greatest kings to ever have sat upon the throne of his forefathers. Arise, arise, riders of Theoden! Fell deeds awake, fire and slaughter, spear shall be shaken, shield be splintered, a sword day, a red day, ere the sun rises. The chant of death was taken up by the warriors of the Mark, as a cacophony of shouts, cheers and horn blasts filled the air, further breaking the morale of the forces of the Dark Lord. Before Theoden pulled his horse, Snowmane, once more to face the might of Sauron, with a light jolt to the side of his trusty mount, the horse jolted forward, and with this came a thundering of hooves that had never before been heard upon the field of Pelennor. 6,000 of Rohan crashed forward, first meeting the hordes of Orcs, which hastily arranged in a pike formation. The servants of Sauron were powerless to stop the flowing tide of cavalry, and were swept under the hooves of the king and his men with ease. Sensing the desperation of the situation, the great chieftain of the Haradrim mounted a countercharge, meeting Theoden head-on in brutal single combat. The fight dragged on, yet the old king did not falter, and struck down his enemy with all the vigour of a man half his age. The Haradrim were further slaughtered as the Rohirrim pushed ever onwards, destroying everything in their path and killing their king, until Theoden looked upon his final foe. The Witch King of Angmar, on his fell beast, swooped downward, mortally wounding the king under the weight of his beloved steed. The sheer terror the Lord of the Nazgul instilled caused Theoden's honour guard to rout, save for one who was known to his comrades as Denhelm throughout the march to Minas Tirith. It was in fact the king's niece, Éowyn, disguised as a man alongside the hobbit Merry. Unwilling to bow before the terror of the Nazgul, she boldly stood her ground, displaying the same courage her king had moments earlier. The Witch King then confidently stated that no living man can kill me, to which the Shield Maiden of Rohan removed her helmet and responded, "No living man am I, you look upon a woman. Éowyn I am, Eamond's daughter. Begone, if you be not deathless, for living or dark undead I will smite you if you touch him." Now she stood alone before the Lord of the Nine, and struck down his fell beast in defence of her beloved uncle, cleaving the beast's neck in one fell swing of her blade. The infuriated Witch King attacked Éowyn with great malice, hefting a large mace, and shattered her shield, breaking her arm in the process and forcing her back. It was at this point that Meriadoc Brandybuck stabbed the creature in the leg with the barrow blade he had picked up so long ago in his journey. The dagger was of the make of the land of Arnor and caused the Nazgul immense pain, bringing him to his knees, while also breaking Merry's arm with the force of the impact. Éowyn, then regaining her footing, thrust her blade through the Witch King's helm, finally fulfilling Glorfindel's prophecy at the Battle of Fornost that not by the hand of man would the leader of the Nine be defeated. Badly weakened by the fight, she succumbed to the Black Breath, which was a result of direct contact with a Nazgul, leaving her hovering close to death. Merry then dragged himself closer to the now dying King of Rohan, and was there to hear the dying words of Theoden, Lord of the Mark. "Farewell, Master Hobbit. My body is broken. I go to my fathers, and even in their mighty company, I shall not now be ashamed." Éomer, despite his heartbreak at the loss of his beloved uncle and the perceived loss of his sister, now assumed control of the Rohirrim. The charge, slowed but not stopped, continued to wreak devastation among the forces of Mordor. The men of Gondor began their own sortie from the gates, catching their foes unawares, and also inflicting heavy casualties upon the forces which were closest to the gate. First among them was Imrahil and his mounted Swan Knights, who cut a bloody swath through the forces of the Dark Lord in an attempt to reach Éomer. The fighting grew bloody and desperate, as the immense weight of the Mumakil and Haradrim, alongside the reserves of the Orcs, kept the men of the West separated, allowing the numerical advantage to once more turn the battle in favour of the servants of the Dark Lord, even in the absence of their overall commander. It was at this point that the hearts of every man of the West sunk as the ships of the Corsairs of Umbar arrived. Despite thinking that their defeat and destruction were inevitable, they fought on. Neither side expected Aragorn, alongside the Grey Company and the southern army of Gondor, to emerge from the ships. Yet the impact of this sudden appearance, symbolised by the unfurling of Arwen's banner by Halbarad, was felt by both sides of the conflict. The newly arrived men of the West, with Aragorn at their head, wielding the blade Anduril, drove a wedge through the forces of the Dark Lord, separating those closest to the city from those nearer to the Anduin. None among the servants of Sauron could stand before the might of Anduril that day, as Aragorn swept aside all who stood in his way, cutting deep into the host which threatened his city. Capitalizing upon these unexpected reinforcements, Imrahil and Éomer marshalled their flagging forces time and again through repeated cavalry and infantry charges, cutting off divisions of the Great Horde and slaughtering them en masse. Most of the host of Mordor was slain, with the Orcs now seeing that victory had slipped from their grasp, fleeing and being cut down in the thousands, with many more drowning as they attempted to cross the Anduin to safety. A large force of Easterlings, whose hatred for the men of Gondor outweighed their own instincts for self-preservation, refused to flee the field and fought to the last man, earning the bitter respect of the men of the West. Some of the more disciplined Orcs rallied a rearguard of sorts, and were successful in inflicting heavy casualties upon both the Gondorian and Rohirrim forces, but soon they were overrun too, with Aragorn finishing the last ones off, effectively ending the Orcish resistance and the Battle of the Pelennor Fields. The losses on both sides were considerable, with nearly the entirety of the forces of Mordor utterly destroyed. This was of little consequence to Sauron, however, as he still possessed large numbers of Orcs within the plains of Gorgoroth, alongside his experimental new Uruk-hai units. It was the loss of his chief lieutenant, the Witch King of Angmar, which he rued most, as he remained irreplaceable in the eyes of the Dark Lord. Casualties suffered by the men of the West were also substantial, with Theoden chief among their number. Éomer estimated that less than 4,000 Rohirrim were now capable of battle, with a large number of his forces dead, injured, or having lost their mounts. All in all, however, Aragorn estimated that even with the soldiers he would need in the coming conflict, the garrison of Minas Tirith, with the addition of the southern armies, was now greater than it had been before the siege. Upon dying, Theoden named Éomer his heir and called him king. Likewise, the Lady Éowyn won renown and was henceforth known in the Mark as the Lady of the Shield Arm. Following the successful defense of Minas Tirith, Aragorn gathered to him all of the wise men of Gondor, as well as his companions and the most prominent men of Rohan, in order to discuss their final moves in the dying embers of the War of the Ring. This came to be known as the Last Debate and was conducted outside of the walls of the city, as Aragorn refused to enter until the war had been won and he could be properly proclaimed king. Many men who were well acquainted with tactics and warfare, such as Imrahil and Éomer, put forward their opinions as to the best course of action. Yet it was the counsel of Gandalf which swayed Aragorn, with the wizard remarking, "We have not the ring. Without it we cannot by force defeat his force. But we must at all costs keep his eye from his true peril. We cannot achieve victory by arms, but by arms we can give the ring-bearer his only chance, frail though it be. We must push Sauron to his last throw. We must call out his hidden strength, so that he shall empty his land. We must march out to meet him at once. We must make ourselves the bait, though his jaws should close on us. We must walk open-eyed into that trap, with courage, but small hope for ourselves." Knowing that Frodo and Sam were now within the depths of Mordor, they were left with no other choice but to march out and meet the Dark Lord. By sacrificing their lives, they could buy the ring-bearer enough time to complete his quest and save Middle-earth for good and all. Each and every one of those gathered at this last debate knew that it was likely death awaited them, yet it was the only course of action now left to them. A garrison of a size greater than had originally guarded the city was left, and the Captain of the West took with him 7,000 soldiers of Gondor and Rohan, alongside his Grey Company. The impossibility of victory was not lost on the men of the West, however, with Imrahil laughing aloud before stating, "Surely this is the greatest jest in all the history of Gondor, that we should ride with 7,000, scarce as many as the vanguard of its army in the days of its power, to assail the mountains and the impenetrable gate of the Black Land. So might a child threaten a mail-clad knight with a bow of string and green willow." The host of the Men of the West left Minas Tirith on March 18th and bypassed Minas Morgul, heading straight for the Black Gate. Sauron, falsely believing that Aragorn now possessed the ring and would use its power against him, fell for this ploy, and began to send all of his warriors to the Black Gate. Aragorn then left a force of just under 1,000 men at the crossroads in order to guard the road to Minas Tirith should the battle go poorly. Midway through Ithilien, they were then assaulted by Haradrim and Easterlings. The soldiers were quickly detected by the rangers of Ithilien, however, and driven off with little casualties. As the Men of the West approached Dagorlad, a number of the farmers of Lossarnach and some of the fainter of heart among the Rohirrim balked at the prospect of assaulting the Black Gate. Aragorn, displaying his compassion, allowed them to leave, instead sending them to liberate Caer Andros, weakening the army even further, so that they maintained a strength of barely 6,000 men. Yet as the host of the West continued ever onwards, they soon came to see the extraordinary vastness of the Black Gate, and even the most valiant among them began to feel the cold tendrils of fear creep through their veins. Heralds were sent upon Prince Imrahil's suggestion to announce the coming of King Elessar. In response, the Black Gate opened a fraction, allowing for a delegation of the Dark Lord to emerge. At their head was a dark Númenórean of the ancient faction of King's Men who had survived the fall of the kingdom and fallen into the service of Sauron. He was known as the Mouth of Sauron and demanded the surrender of the host, producing Frodo's mithril vest and cloak to the despair of Pippin among Aragorn's retinue. Gandalf then asked for the terms of surrender, which were to be Sauron's recognized dominion over Isengard and Rohan, as well as the vassalage of Gondor, to which the Men of the West refused in the plainest of terms. Enraged by their unwillingness to surrender, the Mouth of Sauron withdrew behind the Black Gate, which now opened, allowing a force of between 60 and 100,000 orcs, trolls and Uruk-hai to emerge. On top of that, thousands of orcs surfaced from the hillsides surrounding the plain of Morannon, with another force of Easterlings appearing from the former Gondorian garrison tower of Carchost, ensuring that the Men of the West now knew the true strength of Mordor. These denizens of the dark proceeded to surround the host of the West, ensuring that retreat was no longer an option. In the early stages of the battle, the Dark Lord's warriors found it difficult to reach the Men of the West, due to the large slag pools and pits of waste that surrounded the Black Gate. This bought Aragorn enough time to organize his soldiers. He placed 2 forces of 3,000 each upon the 2 slag piles in the center of the plain of Morannon, which were made up of piles of rubble and waste. The contingent upon the right hill was commanded by Imrahil and Éomer in the front line, while consisting of the Knights of Dol Amroth and elements of the Tower Guard among the regulars of both Rohan and Gondor, while the hill to the left was led by Aragorn alongside Gandalf, the remaining members of the Fellowship, Elladen and Elrohir, sons of Elrond, and the Grey Company, with Arwen's banner flying on its front line. The Dark Lord, with his eye fixed firmly upon the battle, urged his subjects forward. His forces crashed into the host of the West like a tide breaking upon the cliffside. The men of the West held, utilizing their superior discipline and martial prowess, as well as the height advantage afforded by the slag piles, to hold back the orcs, trolls, and evil men. While this valiant defense caused far greater casualties on the part of the Dark Lord, it was not sustainable, and the men of the West were hard pushed to keep up this immense effort. The remaining Nazgûl then emerged, threatening to dismantle the disciplined lines of the host of the West, before the Great Eagles entered the battle, led by their Windlord Gwaihir. The Eagles and Nazgûl fought for aerial superiority, with Pippin echoing the sentiment of Bilbo during the Battle of the Five Armies by repeating aloud, "The Eagles are coming." As the initial attack of the forces of Sauron failed, armoured trolls, wielding crude maces and cudgels, were sent forth. Their attack managed to effectively break down the lines of the men of the West, allowing orcs to swarm through, making Aragorn's position borderline untenable on both slag piles. The orcs further took example of the Easterlings and engaged in flanking maneuvers, attempting to make the most of their encirclement. It was only by the valour and steadfastness of Aragorn's soldiers that the defence of the slag piles could be maintained, despite overwhelming pressure from all sides. Meanwhile, Sam and Frodo, having disguised themselves as orcs, had at this point reached Mount Doom and looked poised to bring the battle to a premature end. Coming to the slopes of the Crack of Doom, Frodo's strength gave out, however, and he fell, only for Sam to carry him on his back across the last few steps. At this point, Gollum attacked the 2 hobbits, with Sam managing to fight him off as Frodo stumbled towards the depths of Mount Doom. Sam, having delayed Gollum long enough, made his way to the Crack of Doom, where, to his horror, Frodo had renounced the quest and claimed the ring as his own, placing it upon his finger. Sauron, now realizing that the ring was within the depths of Mount Doom, pulled his gaze from the plains of Morannon towards the Crack of Doom, calling the Nazgûl to him. This earned the hard-pressed men of the West a reprieve, as without the will of the Dark Lord driving them onwards, his forces began to falter, allowing the warriors on either slag pile breathing space with which they could reform their lines. A shocked and despairing Sam was caught unaware when Gollum attacked him from behind, knocking him unconscious with a rock, before attacking Frodo. The struggle was brief, as Frodo had been weakened by possessing and resisting the will of the ring for as long as he had, ending with Gollum biting off his finger and taking the One Ring from him. Gollum celebrated, reclaiming his precious by dancing maniacally. However, he slipped upon the blood pulsing from Frodo's finger, causing him to fall into the Crack of Doom unwittingly, destroying the One Ring. This caused the destruction of Barad-dûr, the Black Gate, and the Towers of the Teeth, while Mount Doom erupted violently, with the 2 hobbits barely escaping to the mountainside, where they were now surrounded by lava and ash, seemingly doomed, before being rescued by Gandalf, Gwaihir, and his Great Eagles. With the destruction of the ring, Sauron's being and his power were forever lost, and the threat of his dominion ended forever. On the plains of Morannon, the orcs panicked and began to flee, being cut down in droves by the resurgent men of the West, while some of the Easterlings and Haradrim, bearing an undying hatred towards their western counterparts, fought to the last man, being utterly destroyed on that day. Others surrendered and were pardoned by King Elessar. Orc strongholds remained within the plains of Gorgoroth, however, necessitating Aragorn to lead his forces, which were still capable of fighting, immediately into the depths of Mordor to ensure the purging of the area was complete. Aragorn then freed the slaves of Nirn, granting them this extremely fertile area in the far south of the realm of Mordor to be ruled as they wished, following their years of enslavement under the cruel reign of Sauron. After this triumph, Aragorn set up a camp on the field of Cormallen, where great celebrations took place. On May 1st of TA 3019, Aragorn was inaugurated as King Elessar, and a week later, Éomer renewed the Oath of Yall. On May 8th, Éomer and Éowyn departed for Rohan to settle administrative affairs. They both returned to Minas Tirith on July 18th to preside over the movement of late King Theoden's body back to Edoras. On August 10th, a funeral was held for King Theoden outside the walls of Edoras. Yet not all was sad tidings, for that same day, Éomer announced the betrothal of Éowyn to Faramir. Later Éowyn settled in Ithilien, where Faramir was made the ruling prince. Henceforth, Éowyn became known as Lady of Ithilien. The royal couple dwelt in the hills of Emin Arnen. There, Éowyn bore her husband a son, Elberon, who would become the second prince of Ithilien and a steward of Gondor. Elberon would have a son named Barahir, who, after the death of King Elessar, authored the tale of Aragorn and Arwen. After the wedding feast was over, Meriadoc Brandybuck was named Holdwine, or Loyal Friend of the Mark, and given the Horn of the Mark. King Éomer discarded the titles of second and third Marshals of the Mark, and replaced them with Marshal of the West Mark and Marshal of the East Mark. Erkenbrand and Elfhelm were the first appointed to these positions. Although Sauron was no more, the forces who had served him still troubled Middle-earth. Éomer would fulfill the Oath of Yall many times, joining King Elessar to conquer the east and south of Middle-earth. During his reign, Éomer became known as Eodig, or the Blessed, because of how rich and fruitful Rohan had emerged after the War of the Ring. In TA 3021, Éomer married Princess Lithuriel, sister to Elfir, Ecirion, and Prince Imrahil of Dol Amroth. Lithuriel bore Éomer a son named Elfwine the Fair. Éomer honoured his friendship with Knight Meriadoc Brandybuck, who went on to become Master of Buckland in 4th Age 11. Éomer sent him many gifts, and so did Éowyn. In 4th Age 63, Éomer felt death nearing him and asked Merry to visit him one last time. Both Merry and Pippin came to Rohan, staying as guests until autumn, whence King Éomer died. Éomer had reigned for 65 years, the second longest reign to that of Aldor. That year, Elfwine the Fair became King of Rohan, beginning its third line. Thus ends our story, as our author has not left us any more tales about Rohan. But there are always more tales to tell, and we're planning to cover stories of many worlds, both fantasy and sci-fi, so make sure you have subscribed and pressed the bell button. Please consider liking, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Our videos would be impossible without our kind patrons and YouTube channel members, whose ranks you can join via the links in the description to learn our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our Discord, and much more. This is the Wizards and Warriors channel, and we will catch you on the next one.